They were supposed to be the safest children in the city. Adopted as infants into a life most people only read about, Bia and Ana grew up under chandeliers and private jets, under nannies' schedules and the quiet hum of a household run by staff who answered to a single name: Edward Grant. For the world, Edward was a man who had everything: an empire of real estate and tech, a billionaire whose portrait hung in glossy magazines. For his daughters, until recently, he was simply the man who had signed the papers that made them his. But papers do not make presents. Business did, flights did, boardrooms did. So when teachers began calling, and then the school nurse called again with a voice that sounded like someone holding back more than concern, people who knew the Grants assumed it was another problem money could fix. Better doctors, stricter routines, a new specialist flown in from across the country. No one expected the slow, furtive vanishing of appetite, the hollowing of cheeks, the way their laughter carved less and less into the corners of their rooms. Edward's car pulled up the drive on a Tuesday afternoon, earlier than planned. The sky was the brittle cobalt of late autumn. He took the private elevator up from the garage, past framed board minutes and an oil painting of his grandfather. The house smelled faintly of lemon and something metallic, antiseptic from the home clinic, perhaps, or the scent of medicine bottles stored in neat trays. As the elevator doors opened, he saw, on the wall-mounted screen in the foyer, a real-time grid of security feeds. Nurses and staff moved like chess pieces through the mansion's many rooms. The girls' wing showed two tiny figures on a pale rug, thin shoulders hunching as they ate from mismatched bowls under Cassandra's watchful, anxious eyes. Cassandra Grant had been a quieter kind of celebrity, a former interior designer whose marriage to Edward thrust her into a life of headlines. She had been the girl's primary caregiver since Edward had left the home more often. She was the one who read the bedtime stories, the one who remembered which stuffed animal went with which twin. Lately, she had been the one on the phone at odd hours, her jaw tight, her eyes rimmed with red. Edward had intended the visit as a surprise, a rare attempt to be present for dinner. Instead, he walked into a small scene that made his chest tighten. Cassandra at the kitchen island, backlit by the blue glow of a tablet, a ladle in her hand, two shallow bowls of the same thin broth sitting between them. The broth was watery, almost clear, and the girls ate it with the automatic smallness of children who had been taught to manage hunger as a discrete, manageable thing. He saw the bowl closer. A film clung to the surface, and beyond it he saw the pinched outline of the girl's wrists. Bia turned the handle of the spoon with a practiced, almost exhausted rhythm. Ana stared at the television screen across the room with a hunger that was both want and part mechanical habit. The sight of them like that, so small inside a house built to hold anything, was a jolt that cracked something open in him. A week earlier, there had been clean lab tests. A battery of blood work and scans returned no obvious disease. Doctors at the private clinic in his building ran panels, checked hormones, scanned for malabsorption syndromes. The lab slips returned sterile rectangles of medical language. No structural abnormality noted. CBC within limits. No metabolic disruption evident. The word psychosomatic had surfaced in one consult, thinly veiled and yet so accurate it felt cruel. The suggestion that the body was responding to something the mind would not or could not say. Outside the house, that suggestion translated into whispers. Teachers speculated about picky eating, about a child under the social pressure of expectation of perfection. The maternal grandparents, Cassandra's parents, had arrived like storm clouds, their voices low and sharp when they thought no one would hear. They were the kind of relatives who used love as a club. They demanded answers in tones that made nurses shrink. Someone called Child Protective Services. The agency sent a social worker whose neat hair and clipboard felt out of place among the soft rugs and polished wood. The social worker's visit made the household edge tighter, as if the presence of an authority amplified all the unspoken failures. Edward listened to all of it with a growing inward anger that tasted like salt. He had been absent, yes, he knew that. He had been absent and had assumed absence could be bought back with the right attention at the right hour. He had bought specialists, flown in consultants, rearranged schedules. Yet the hollow in her daughter's faces widened. He had missed their retreat into smaller bodies. He had trusted Cassandra to be the steady hand. Trust had been what let him fly away. That night he did not sleep. He watched the feed from the nursery on a tablet by his bed until the blue light blurred his eyes. At 3 a.m. he went downstairs. The house hummed with refrigeration, the soft click of security doors, the distant pulse of a generator. Cassandra was at the kitchen island again, hair pulled in a knot, the thin broth glinting in the light. When she saw him, she smiled with the practiced affability of someone who knows her audience. "We called you," she said. "The school. The doctor says—" Her voice ran out, like a thread that had been pulled too hard. "You should have called me," Edward said. His voice was flat. It was trying and failing to keep out the weight of everything he had not been. Cassandra's eyes flicked towards the twins through the archway, towards their small forms in a shadowed living room. "She couldn't," she said. "I left a message." She pointed to the grander picture, his trips, his accounts, his absence, and made herself into the person who held the family together between his departures. Edward believed her in the way people believe until evidence removes the option. But the seed of suspicion, once planted, changed how he looked at the bowls on the kitchen island. He noticed patterns. The twins were given, more and more often, sheer soups and strained solids. The portion sizes were measured with an almost clinical precision. Cassandra would plate the adult meals first and send the girls their own bowls, smaller, pale, and always the same. When he watched the security footage at night, he saw Cassandra linger with the ladle over the girls' bowls for a fraction longer than seemed necessary. She would exchange a look with the nurse, and the nurse, eyes cast down, would carry the leftovers to the staff refrigerator as if they had always tasted the same. Money changes the shape of an investigation. It can buy experts, private labs, people who will look away, but it also offers resources that those without it do not have: non-disclosure agreements, private investigators, and the leverage to demand inconvenient truths. Edward, compelled by a paternal panic that felt like a fossil awakened, hired someone discreet. He did not speak to police at first. Police, he knew, would mean headlines, would mean social workers on the front steps and cameras outside the gate, would mean the girls confined to foster care as potential safety until the streets cooled. He could not bear the idea of that. He wanted, first, to know. He wanted, second, to act with a kind of quiet finality that could be brought into a courtroom if necessary. The investigator, a woman named Mara who had been recommended by an old friend on Wall Street, came with patience and a binder of methods that didn't look at all like the ones in television dramas. She watched the house for days, cross-referencing shift changes, noting how Cassandra moved through the rooms like a conductor of a small, anxious orchestra. Mara asked to see the kitchen after dinner and took a sample of the broth from the sink's basin where dishes had been rinsed. She had a way of moving that made the staff forget to perform. A sample labeled in crisp pen was sent to a private lab that specialized in trace analysis, compounds at levels so low they often escaped the cursory panels used by even the best private clinics. The sample came back on a gray Tuesday evening when the house seemed to hold its breath. Edward was at his desk in the study, the room that faced the city, lit sometimes by news anchors' monotone and sometimes by nothing at all. He had stacked the girls' school drawings against a marble paperweight. A small photograph showed him, years prior, laughing as 2 tiny babies clung to his shirt, Bia with a curl of hair over her ear, Ana with a solemn, skeptical gaze. He had framed the image after the adoption, and it had sat on his desk like a talisman against the storms of work. The report arrived as an encrypted PDF on his phone. The lab's header was clinical and anonymous. Edward opened it with a thumb that did not stop shaking. There were numbers and chemical names he did not know, neat bullet points. Then, under a line that collected all the sterile language, a phrase that hit like a fist: presence of an active anorectic compound consistent with prescription appetite suppression. There were traces at low levels, but levels that, with chronic exposure, would be expected to reduce appetite and alter metabolic markers. Under interpretation, the report noted that the pattern was consistent with repeated administration rather than a single accidental ingestion. He read it twice, and in the quiet house the words translated into a different kind of language: deliberate, repeated, intended. His first thought, absurd and immediate, drifted to the other evidences the investigator had provided. A photograph of Cassandra waving goodbye to Dr. Cassio at the staff gate, a blurred screenshot of a chat where the two planned an exchange after hours, a bank transfer to an account registered under a name that could not be found in the household directory. The chat was not explicit about harm, it spoke in euphemisms and nicknames. But when Edward looked at the faces in the photos, Cassandra's hand on Cassio's arm, their heads close, the intimacy tasted like betrayal. He walked through the house that night like a man moving through someone else's memory. The twins slept in a bunk room with pastel curtains and a mobile that still turned above Anna's bed. The mobile cast tiny shadows that crawled across the ceiling. When he looked at their small frames, he felt something like a fracture of identity. A man who had built an empire and in the building had not kept what mattered most. Edward called Mara and told her to expedite everything. He asked her to find out who Dr. Cassio really was and what his relationship with Cassandra might mean. She called back with a profile: Dr. Cassio Ribeiro, pediatrician with private practice, affiliated with several elite clinics, reputation for discretion, recent bank activity that included transfers to a relative of Cassandra's mother. He had run in the same social circuits as the Grants, charitable galas, pediatric conferences hosted by hospitals that relied on wealthy benefactors. Inclusion in such circles bought many people silence. Edward began to keep a record. He printed the lab report. He had the luxury, in a way that cut like a knife, of putting stacks of paper into a safe and watching his own world organize into evidence. Yet evidence, he also realized, shifted something else. It made him feel culpable. Each form, each notarized note became an accusation against his own complacency. Had he not noticed earlier the smallness of the twins' clothes? Had he not marked with a flippant satisfaction the way they had never wanted for anything? He had designed their life to be large. He had not prepared himself for the ways largeness can dilute attention. In the neighbors' homes, in the community that circulated whispers into the wider world, no one seemed to understand the quiet corrosiveness of these omissions. There was an assumption that money prevented harm. It does not. It can simply make harm less visible. Cassandra's parents were, outwardly, shrill in their grief and pointed about blame. They did not look at Edward with the kind of mercy he might have bought. They looked at him with a judgment sharpened by their own fear. "You were gone," they told him. He could have taken the lab report directly to the police. He could have called the social worker who had come the previous week, sat across from her in the sunroom and said, "I have proof." But that would have triggered a cascade: the removal of the children, hearings, media, speculation, legal entanglements. He thought of the twins in temporary foster placements, of strangers with kind hands who would not know the particularities of their fears. He thought of the way institutions sometimes move slowly, even when they are sure. He thought of the headline, "Billionaire Father Accused After Private Tests," and felt the old ingrained fear of loss to the public eye. Instead, he did what men like him often do. He used his resources to gather more. He asked Mara to get chat logs, bank transfers, anything that suggested motive. He asked the household staff if any money had been missing. He combed through 60 days of CCTV footage, not with the dullness of a person who watches for patterns, but with the intensity of a man searching for the moment his family had been rearranged around a lie. The pattern revealed itself like a map. There were nights when Cassandra left the house after midnight, nights when she returned with retail bags empty and an exhausted smile. There were discreet transfers from her accounts to an online gambling wallet, chips bought and lost in increments. She had, as everyone does in desperation, begun to hide the losses in small ways. She took cash out and repaid it from tips the nannies received. She pawned pieces of jewelry under aliases. But there was also an emerging picture of a plan that required more than personal solvency. It required an absence in the girls, a hand that could make them small enough to generate an outcome, a tragedy that might bring money in the form of insurance, or, at the very least, the shifting of the household into guardians who would pay to keep quiet. Edward read the messages Mara had pulled from a cloud backup, a sparsely worded banter between Cassandra and a someone saved under the name Doc. They were never explicit, but the ellipses were eloquent. Tonight? Same time? Got the usual? He found, too, a photo of Cassandra and Dr.
Cassio on the patio of a small restaurant, wine glasses lifted. In another image, Cassandra leaned back in laughter, a line of worry on her brow smoothed by the indulgence of the man beside her. The images did not, alone, prove intent. Intimacy and possibility are not the same as conspiracy. But with the lab report in his hand, with the sample's analysis echoing through his skull, intimacy began to look like a plan. The house felt like a theater where every performance had been rehearsed for months. Cassandra could argue, if pressed, that the broth was merely part of a controlled diet prescribed by some doctor, that their private pediatrician was simply overseeing treatment. Dr. Cassio, if asked, would present his notes and voice concern for the twins' mental health. He would speak of a family under stress. He might even offer, with the empathy of someone who knows how to manage scandals, that he had worked hard to prevent separation, to keep the children in a stable environment. But the lab report did not care about words. The chemical trace said a pattern existed. There was a motive in the financial records, a means in the broth, and opportunity in the overnight departures and clandestine meetings. For the first time since he had signed the adoption papers, Edward felt the full immensity of his power and the insufficiency of it to undo harm done within the walls he had paid to build. He called the pediatric hospital where Dr. Cassio held privileges under the pretense of a routine administrative question. He heard, thin and professional, that a complaint could lead to inquiries, that such steps are slow and documented. He felt the weight of procedure, the bureaucracy that his wealth could not simply bulldoze without leaving traces he did not want. That afternoon, a social worker returned with a clipboard and a firmness in her voice that made the household staff tighten. "We've had reports," she said, "and we need to ensure the girls' safety." She asked about rooting and feeding. She asked for the medical files. She asked if anyone in the household could provide an account of their daily routine. Cassandra sat with her hands clenched, answering politely. Edward handed over the lab note, but hedged his language. "We're investigating," he told the woman, the legality of his phrasing a shield. "We've had a private analysis done." The social worker nodded as if that were meaningful, and for the first time Edward felt the world tilt into two kinds of certainty: the certainty of what the tests suggested, and the terrifying bureaucratic certainty that the moment he let the state into this house, he would lose a measure of control. It was not malice that kept him from going straight to the police. It was a complicated calculus that included the children's welfare, the public spectacle of a trial, and the gnawing need to be the man who could fix this without turning his daughters into a story. He did not want to be the man who, in trying to protect his children, destroyed them with exposure. After the social worker left, Edward went back to his office. He sat with the lab report under the lamp and thumbed the photo of the girls, then a real raw thing in his hand, two small hands clutching his fingers. He thought of the adoption's first day, the tiny faces turned up to him trusting. He had polled the papers, the philanthropic donors, the charities, and had felt whole. Could he be responsible for letting the person who had promised to protect them become the instrument of their slow diminishment? The thought was an ache that bloomed behind the ribs. He picked up his phone and scrolled through messages from Cassandra that had been backed up to the cloud. Most were domestic, requests for grocery orders, notes about the school play, silly emojis he hadn't noticed. But tucked between them was a small thread where Cassandra referenced building something and keeping the plan quiet. He had the messages printed out within the hour. Edward knew the law required cautious steps. He also knew how evidence builds. Photographs, chats, bank transfers, and lab analyses build a latticework that can be shown in a court or, more urgently, to a judge who can order protective custody without forcing the girls into the public spectacle. He began to assemble the paper trail like a man assembling a weapon, except what he was building was not for destruction, but for defense. He told himself he would call the police the next morning. He told himself he would inform the head of security at the hospital where Dr. Cassio practiced. He told himself he would find a way to keep the girls safe and to bring Cassandra to sober account for what she had allegedly allowed to happen. There were quiet people in the house who watched him grow more determined by the hour. Nannies who had once regarded Cassandra with gratitude suddenly wore expressions of suspicion. The maternal grandparents grew more vocal in their accusations, now aimed not at Cassandra, but at Edward for not seeing sooner. The story, as it always does, became a story of blame. Edward, for the first time in years, wanted nothing to do with the courtesies of society. He wanted justice. Night fell, and the house settled into a thin, fragile routine. Bia and Ana slept in rooms that smelled of lavender and dust, their small chests rising in shallow, even rhythm. Cassandra, exhausted, sat in the study with a glass of something that made her hand tremble, and the blue light of the tablet turned the planes of her face into an image that made Edward's stomach knot with a mixture of pity and cold rage. He opened a file on his desktop and compiled everything the investigator had found. The lab result, the CCTV stills of Cassandra with the man named Doc, the bank transfer receipts, the screenshots of chats. The file was a quiet, brutal thing. He saved it as a single document and then encrypted it, and then printed 2 copies, one for the police, should he call them, one for a lawyer who would know how to move delicately through the system without turning his private family into a public spectacle. Then, at 2 in the morning, he stood in the doorway of the twins' room and watched them breathe. He felt both the wrongness of his absence and the thin thread of agency that remained to him. He pressed his hand to the doorframe until the wood warmed beneath his palm. The world outside his gates was oblivious to the calculus that now defined the next days of his life. Inside, the calculations multiplied into decisions. He would not be the absent man any longer. If the law required waiting and procedure, he would create his own timeline for truth. He would not act out of spectacle, and he would not act in a way that endangered his children. But he would gather, collect, and confront. He would follow the evidence until it led him to the answer he needed. As dawn rose, a small, understated voice came from the kitchen. The housekeeper had been there all night, watching watches and noting odd discordances. She had left a small journal on a side counter, a dated log of what the girls ate, when they woke, the little scratched notes that people who care for children collect without thinking the records will one day be used in a stranger's case. Edward took the journal, leafed through the tiny entries, and found on the margins a pattern, notes crossed out, abbreviations for times when the girls had eaten less, an occasional tally that counted cups. The tally looked, in the end, like a map. He called Mara and told her to prepare the next phase, gather direct evidence linking Cassandra to the soup. Mara, calm and methodical, already had plans for how to do it without violating privacy laws, staff interviews, bank document subpoenas, and, if necessary, asking the police to take a sample chain of custody that could stand in court. Edward agreed, and the plan took on a momentum that was both terrifying and necessary. When the police finally came, it was midweek. They were polite, their badges careful and unassuming. Edward handed them the lab report, the printouts of messages, the CCTV stills. Their faces did not show much. They asked to speak with Cassandra. Cassandra listened and answered with a voice that oscillated between detachment and alarm. She presented herself as a mother who had failed, a woman overwhelmed. She cried in ways practiced by those whose lives have taught them when tears earn sympathy. Dr. Cassio, when contacted, arranged a meeting at his office under the guise of coordinating care. He was solemn and reassuring. He talked about the complexity of pediatric malnutrition diagnoses and the need for psychiatric involvement. He offered to review his notes and to be fully transparent. He said under his breath, "We all have the girl's best interest at heart."
For a second, he considered taking her in his arms and telling her that if she had confessed, they could find a way forward. But that was the language of denial, of mercy when mercy would amount to impunity. He needed facts. "I have evidence," he said quietly. "The lab sample returned positive for an appetite suppressant. There are transfers and messages. I'm going to the police, formally." Her face, which had been composed of rehearsed expressions, began to fracture. She flinched as if at the name of a wound. "You'll ruin everything," she whispered. "For what? For your ego? For their attention?" Edward did not answer. He would not let the conversation become a cross-examination between private wills. He walked past her toward the twins' wing. Outside, the city pulsed, and the world went about its unaware business. For Edward, inside his mansion, the ordinary structure of life had become a cross-section of evidence and memory. He would have to act, and his acts would ripple outward, through police reports, through hospital wards, through the graves of public perception. He accepted that, with the heavy resignation of someone who has just realized the moral ledger of his life. The next morning's light felt colder. The police had taken the sample from the kitchen under the chain of custody, catalogued in a way that would make it admissible in court. Lab technicians in a government facility agreed to run a confirmatory test. The media did not yet know. The police kept the case closed, citing ongoing protective measures. Edward felt the double edge of secrecy and loneliness like a physical presence. There was one more thing he needed, proof that Cassandra's actions had not been random or accidental, that they pointed to motive. It was a legal truth that motive is not necessary to convict, but a moral element that explains how a human being could do such harm. Mara found among the financial threads a pattern of losses at several online gambling sites, a balance of debt scraped into new accounts, and a pair of insurance policies that had been recently modified, policies with clauses that would pay out under certain circumstances. The modifications were legally permissible, executed with Cassandra's signature in her handwriting.
That did not in itself prove malicious intent, but scarred across these documents the shape of desperation. Edward inspected the bank statements and the transfers like a man reviewing blueprints for demolition. Each line was an argument, each withdrawal was a story. He sat at the dining table with the documents spread like a forensic map. Bia and Anna's drawings sat nearby, their crayons marking innocent horizons. He pinched the bridge of his nose until a small headache bloomed behind his eyes. He could now imagine the possible trajectories.
He could imagine an insurance claim, a legal settlement, perhaps an argument that could be spun into a tragic narrative that would, in some perverse calculus, provide financial relief for Cassandra. He could imagine even worse manipulations, deals with someone who understood how to convert a family's pain into cash. The presence of Dr. Cassio in the picture added a professional sheen to it, a doctor who could rationalize and prescribe, who could explain symptoms as psychiatric rather than toxicological, who held influence over both medical opinion and, potentially, documentation. The confirmation from the public lab arrived in a dry email. Presence of anorectic compound confirmed. The public lab's language was careful, procedural, consistent with repeated exposure. It was enough to become a turning point, enough to transform suspicion into something that could compel formal action. The police moved more swiftly after that confirmation. Interviews, subpoenas, recorded statements. Dr. Cassio's phone was flagged for investigation. Cassandra was asked to be available for questioning. At the end of the day, Edward sat in the nursery and listened to the faint shuffles of the twins' footsteps as they moved in their sleep. He thought of all the ways a life like his could be measured, by net worth, by headlines, by accomplishments, and he felt the scales tip toward a more private inventory, the tally of what he had missed, the hours he had given to other people, the number of meals procured by others' hands. He had not been there to see the incremental theft of appetite. Money had not prevented it. He also knew something else, an elemental truth that the evidence had already whispered to him. The presence of motive changes the nature of a crime. It makes it malice instead of negligence. It turns a tragedy into a choice. He had the evidence now. He had the lab confirmation, the photographs, the chat screenshots, the bank records that sketched the outline of the financial hole Cassandra had been trying to fill. The next steps would involve police statements, protection for the girls, and the slow, inevitable procession of legal process. But the immediate future, the tight space of the next hours, belonged to a man who had to decide how to act, not in the theater of headlines, but in the private theater where children eat and sleep and grow. He rehearsed in a small, private way the conversations to come. At the center of it all was the thing that had led him here. He had loved 2 children enough to claim them under his name. He had built them a life. He would not, now, allow the life he had built to be their undoing. He called his lawyer. He arranged for the girls to stay that night at his mother's house, someone off the estate, not in the glare, a quiet place with soft floors, and a woman who had raised him whole before the world taught him to divide his time.
He sent the girls away under cover of dusk, and watched, for the first time, someone else tuck them in. His mother called him after she read through the paperwork. Her voice was a reed of steadiness. "Keep them there," she said. "No statements tonight. Sleep if you can." He slept in fits and starts, haunting the perimeter of his own house like a man who had been given a map with too many red X's. The next morning the house entered its official choreography. Interviews in sterile rooms, phones put in evidence bags, polite detectives asking structured questions that made the day feel like a deposit into a slow legal machine. Edward watched them move through his kitchen as if through someone else's home, prodding into closets he had never opened and asking staff to sign statements about what they had served the girls on particular nights. Cassandra answered their questions with the steadiness of someone who had practiced for a stage. She told of sleeplessness and worry, of the pressure of being watched, of nights when she felt she had failed. When the detective asked about the late-night meetings, she said, "He was a friend, he's been helping us." She framed it in the language of care, soft and rehearsed. Mara pressed deeper. She had, in the days since the initial discovery, done what investigators do best. She moved like a quiet tide across the data. She produced chat logs that had once been dismissed as ambiguous banter and showed how the euphemisms aligned with bank transfers. She produced a short, grainy audio clip, an after-hours file captured by a clinic sign-up log, where a voice identified as Cassio's could be heard saying, "It's about appetite control. Keep it on schedule." The phrase clipped, the context missing, but the implication vast. The defense could argue technicality. The prosecution could claim conspiracy. It was, for now, evidence enough that a line had been crossed from professional care into something more sinister. Police moved to execute a search warrant on Dr. Cassio's office. He arrived at the clinic that morning as if to begin his day, cufflinks reflecting the pale hospital light. Asked to come to the station for voluntary questioning, he did so with a lawyer at his shoulder and an expression that balanced grief and calculation. He maintained his professional stance in interviews, talk of differential diagnoses, of family dynamics, of the difficulty of diagnosing pediatric malnutrition when the causes are behavioral, not toxicological. When the investigators mentioned the lab results, his hands tightened lightly on the folder he carried. "I would expect confirmation," he said. "We must avoid jumping to clinical conclusions." It was the combination of things, the lab confirmation from the private sample, the public lab's corroboration, the chat logs, the bank transfers, and the CCTV stills that turned suspicion into action. Dr. Cassio's phone showed transfers that tracked against the same schedule as Cassandra's withdrawals.
A voice log pulled from his voicemail, one that the investigator had secured under subpoena, contained a clipped, worried message from Cassandra asking, "Are we still on for tonight?" followed by a terse reply from a contact saved as C. It was not a smoking gun that proved intent, but it was a lattice, point by point, that investigators could show a jury and a judge. Meanwhile, Edward began to move differently. The private fortress he had built around his family became porous. He was no longer the absentee dad with a charitable smile at a gala. He was present, sometimes hovering in the doorway of the nursery, sometimes sitting with the girls' drawings and tracing the tiny sons with a finger. The guilt he had carried for years mutated into a focused, almost clinical resolve. He attended every interview, read every report, and watched the way Cassandra performed sorrow like a routine she had learned. The social worker assigned to the case recommended temporary protective measures. The police, after the lab confirmation, filed to have the children placed under protective custody while the investigation unfolded, standard procedure in cases where exposure to a harmful substance was not definitively isolated. But Edward argued, and argued successfully, for a familial placement that would keep the girls in an environment of familiarity, his mother's house. The judge, briefed on the evidence and convinced the immediate danger was mitigated by the girl's relocation to a trusted relative, agreed. That degree of control felt to Edward like the thin line between action and disaster. For Cassandra, the narrative darkened. The maternal grandparents, who at first browbeaten Edward for his absence, shifted their public posture into something like fury, accusing him of betrayal, of having taken the girls with his money, and now investigating their mother as if her grief were a convenient storyline. They thronged local charity events with worried faces and whispered accusations. Their presence made Cassandra defensive in a way that felt like armor being forged in the wrong heat.
One afternoon, a week after the lab confirmation, Cassandra asked to see the girls. She arranged, at the behest of her lawyer, to meet at the gate of the estate under the watchful eye of a police officer whose uniform made her flinch. She stood with legal counsel and a look of estrangement, and when the car carrying Edward's mother and the twins pulled up, Cassandra crossed the lawn as if compelled by gravity. She knelt when the girls were in range and put her hands on their shoulders, speaking to them in a small, urgent tone that sounded like pleading. Bia's fingers clung to a doll. Ana hid behind the safety of her grandmother's skirt. The social worker waited with a tablet that logged the visit. Edward watched from the sunroom window, a figure framed by light as if he were a portrait come to life.
He wanted to step outside, to take the girls and tell Cassandra that she would answer for this in every way the law allowed. Instead, he watched, a man learning the contours of patience. Cassandra's greeting was a whisper. She kissed the top of Anna's hair, then Bia's. The girls were polite and small, wary of the person who had once read them stories. Cassandra's eyes flicked toward Edward for a moment, an unsteady flicker of recognition and accusation. She mouthed something he couldn't hear, and then stood and left, moving as if she had been repulsed by the weight of being watched. Behind the scenes, the investigators continued to collect evidence. Under search warrants, they found transaction records tying several large outgoing transfers from Cassandra to a pair of accounts associated with an LLC that, upon closer look, had connections to gambling platforms and a shell corporate address. They found receipts for trips booked under aliases, weekends at hotels where Cassandra had registered under different names. They found in the clinic's scheduling log after-hours appointments that overlapped with the times when the CCTV showed Cassandra and Dr. Cassio leaving together. A nurse's statement described an exchange of pills prescribed to control appetite that had not been logged under the twins' chart. Confrontation, as it often does in these stories, was inevitable. Edward chose a place for it, the study. He had sat there with file upon file for days, moving the pieces of paper like a person solving a puzzle that doubled as a wound. He invited Cassandra to meet with him and his lawyer in the study under the watchful protocol of his counsel. When she arrived, her hands were steady in a way that suggested she had rehearsed steadiness in the mirror. Her eyes, however, were bright with an edge of hysteria. She did not come alone. Her lawyer and her parents lingered outside the doorway like sentries. The room smelled of polished oak and coffee. Edward did not preface. He laid the evidence on the table. The lab printouts, the bank statements, the CCTV stills of her leaving with a man whose posture in each photograph suggested intimacy rather than professional distance. He set a binder open to a printout of the investigator's notes, Mare's handwriting precise and merciless. He placed beside it a copy of the chat log where Cassandra had written, "We need the plan to go smoothly," and where a response from a contact saved under Dr. C read, "On schedule, keep her steady." Cassandra's face did not crumple. It moved in that mechanical sequence people practice when their inner life detaches from the outer mask. Her voice, when she spoke, was small and contained. "You have things you want to say, so say them." Edward's lawyer spoke first, with the dry professionalism of someone who knows how to phrase an accusation without screaming it. "We have probable cause to believe," he said, "that the children were exposed repeatedly to an appetite-suppressant compound. We have financial records that show transfers and patterns consistent with gambling losses. We have communications that suggest coordination. Mr. Grant would like to hear your explanation." She laughed then, a short sound that could have been a sob. "Explanation?" she said. "There isn't one that will make any of this okay." Her fingers found the edge of the table like a lifeline. She looked at Edward with a kind of clarity he had not seen in her before, an absence of pleading, a kind of cold calculation that made the hairs along his arms stand up.
The next minutes unfolded like a slow release of a tightly wound spring. Cassandra did not deny the transfers. She admitted, in halting sentences that folded into each other, to gambling. She admitted to debts that had swallowed savings and to panic that had made her take desperate measures. But she did not at first confess to administering anything. She moved instead into a strange moral contortion. She spoke of being overlooked, of living in a house where the man who bought her marriage remained a phantom, of feeling unseen even as the world applauded the grant name. "You were never here," she said. "Do you know what that does to a person who is supposed to love children? It makes you radical. It makes you plan." Her voice shifted from remorse to a frost of rationalization. She described, in a voice that was both intimate and clinical, the calculus she had made in sleepless hours, that reducing appetite would make the girls need more care, that it would bring doctors into the house, that their frailty might prompt compensation, an outcome she framed, chillingly, as a way out. She did not say it with malice exactly. She said it with a warped sense of logic, as if money were not the motive, but a solution she could engineer to the problem of her debts. When Edward pressed, hard, the way an injured man presses, she laughed without humor. "You think I wanted to hurt them?" she asked. "I wanted more time. I wanted to be free. Desperation does the rest." The room's air thickened. She moved as if toward denial, then away. Then, without warning, she reached beneath her coat and produced a small handgun. The motion was swift, a blurred arc in the eyes of witnesses. A gun appeared on her palm like a punctuation mark written in cold metal. The lawyer to her side moved forward, hands up in the universal gesture of dissuasion. Cassandra held the gun with a steadiness that indicated she had practiced it mentally as much as physically. Her mouth curled into something like a smile. "You don't get to take them from me," she said. "You don't get to make it all right by paperwork. If I can't have a life, no one can take them from me as payment for your sins." Edward's instinct was not to fight. It was to deflect, to cajole, to find a word that could untie the moment.
He spoke with a father's voice that was not yet hardened into judgment. "Cass," he said, the name small and heavy, "you're hurting them. You're hurting them and you're hurting yourself. Put the gun down. This isn't the way." She laughed again, a sound devoid of light. "I told you to look after them," she said. "You gave me the house and the role and flew away. I did what had to be done to keep our name intact." Her eyes flashed to the door, as if measuring an escape route, then back to him. "You don't know what it is to be empty in a house like this. It eats you." There was a beat where everyone in the room held their breath, and then Cassandra moved, not toward the door, but toward the staircase that led up to the nursery. She pushed past her lawyer, who reached for her sleeve and missed, and ran upstairs with the gun held against her side, like an instrument both of show and threat. The lawyer shouted. The police officer on the property radioed for backup. Edward followed as if powered by a single impulse. He did not carry a weapon. His advantage was the element of surprise that came from being unarmed, and so, by some dark alchemy, less dangerous in her eyes than a person who might hurt her. He reached the landing and saw her ahead, small against the pattern of wallpaper, the gun a dark presence. The twins' door was ajar, the pale curtains billowed in the slight draught of the hall. Cassandra stood with the gun at her hip and the two girls between them, like fragile objects in the middle of the violence. "What do you want?" Edward asked, his voice steady but low. She stepped closer, the gun now in view. "I want you to give them to me. I want the house back. I want the debts paid. I want the life I saw when I married you." She sounded as if she had rehearsed every line. "I want not to be laughed at when I say I saved them." It was then that the confession, the slow, terrible piece of reality, came out whole.
She spoke of the pills she had been using, how she had begun some months ago with benign-sounding supplements and moved in a spiral to prescription compounds she thought she could source through friends of friends. She named gambling debts and the people who collect it, and she named the insurance adjustments she had requested, clauses that would make a hospital settlement likelier. She never fully said she wanted them dead. She said instead that she had wanted them to be small enough, fragile enough, to draw attention and contracts. Her voice, when it came, was flat. I needed them to need me. Edward's lawyer moved between them. He spoke with the authority of someone seeking to de-escalate, to buy a moment. Cassandra, stand down. Put the gun on the floor. We can sort this. We can talk to the police. Her eyes flicked to him as if to measure whether he was sincere.
Then she did something no one expected. She struck a match, an action that in that forensic second seared the memory of everyone who would later testify. She struck it with a slight wrist and held it like a small defiant candle. The match glowed yellow and fragile in the stairwell. No one saw what she had in her other hand until the smell reached them, a sharp chemical burn that made the back of throats ache. Cassandra moved with a calm that stunned even the officers rushing the house. She tossed the small light toward a stack of curtains folded at the foot of the twins' door. Fabric caught, and in the seconds that followed, a small bloom of flame licked the air. The staircase became a corridor of heat and noise. Smoke puffed like some awful exhalation. Panic is not cinematic. It is brittle and immediate. The lawyer tried to snatch Cassandra's arm. She spun, a motion that sent papers and photographs fluttering like pale leaves. Edward lunged for the girls. He grabbed Bia first and felt how light she was, how little she had eaten in recent weeks. He scooped Ana next, her arms closing around his neck with the reflexive trust of a child. Heat washed up the stairs, the crackle of flames filling the hall. The sequence that followed was a blur described later in precise, terrified testimony. Neighbors and staff remembered screams and the shrill siren of the alarm system. Someone called the fire brigade. Cassandra moved with a terrible, determined clarity that suggested she had fought this through, if only to the extent that she understood that fire would create chaos and cover. She pushed past the crowd and toward the front door, then stopped as if weighing options. For a breathless moment she looked at Edward and, with a voice that could have been a whisper or a shout, said, "If I can't have them, no one will take them like you do." In the doorway, instead of following through to an exit, she turned and ran along the side of the house toward the old servants' gate that emptied onto the lane. Security footage later would show a shadowy figure in a dark coat slip through the gate and disappear into the palm trees that lined the property. The footage was grainy, the face was indistinct. It could be Cassandra. It could be her coat tossed the other way. There were arguments later in court about the angle of the camera and the quality of the image. For now, the house burned. Edward did not wait. He grabbed each girl and ran to the nearest window in the nursery, an old wide bay that opened onto a terrace with a shallow drop. He hoisted Bia onto his shoulders and then pushed through the glass with the primal strength that belongs to a person protecting their children. He landed on gravel, catching his breath in ragged gasps as the air filled with smoke. Anna's windpipe coughed and made a harsh sound as she clung to him. Staff and neighbors pulled at his legs, trying to help.
The fire brigade arrived within minutes, but minutes in a house are a lifetime. Inside, the house became a furnace. The sunroom, once filled with magazines and polished wood, became a geometry of heat and collapse. Officers later would say that a combination of flammable upholstery and a draft had made the small, stubborn flame roar. Firefighters fought to find the origin. They found the curtains in a particular patch of scorched wood at the base of the twins' door. They found a small metal lighter brand that could be traced, with effort, to a purchase Cassandra had made under a pseudonym. As the house burned, Cassandra's silhouette was unclear.
Some staff swore they had seen her near the lane. Others said she had been pulled back by a neighbor who recognized her and stopped her progress. A witness later testified to seeing a woman in a dark coat run toward the gate and then vanish behind the hedges. Another neighbor, a man who walked his dog at dawn, said he might have seen a woman's coat in the distance moving toward a bus route that left the neighborhood. The physical evidence was messy. The human stories were messier. In the hours after the evacuation, the police treated the scene as a crime scene. They cordoned the area and moved with the rhythm of professionals who must make order from chaos. They took statements from staff, from the lawyer who had tried to restrain Cassandra, from neighbors who had helped carry the girls from the window, and from Mara, who had been on the property when Cassandra moved upstairs. Cassandra's parents were there, consumed by a contradictory grief that looked suspiciously like self-preservation. The maternal grandparents shouted accusations they would later tone down under the advice of counsel. When the firefighters finally extinguished the last embers, the house that had once represented safety to everyone in it was a gutted frame. Insurance investigators moved in, taking photographs and cataloging damage. Officials would later describe the scene as intentional ignition, based on accelerant traces found in the stairwell, but the phrasing in police reports remained careful, suspected, alleged, under investigation. The country, had this been a different life, might have had the spectacle it loves, a billionaire's mansion aflame on a dramatic front page. But the flames burned mostly in the private record, photographs in the police file, charred fragments kept in evidence bags. Cassandra's trail went cold and then hot again. For 2 days she was listed as a missing person. Hotspots of rumors ignited, sightings at bus stations, a video of a woman matching her hike in a convenience store, security camera footage of a shadow near the station. The only piece of incontrovertible footage remained the grainy file of the figure passing through the servants' gate. For the police, it raised a question. Was she fleeing the scene or the moment?
Was she injured, trapped, or deliberately obscure in her disappearance? A witness, a neighbor who had lived in the lane for 20 years, later told officers that she believed the woman had boarded a late-night bus bound for the coast. Meanwhile, evidence collected at the clinic hardened the case against Dr. Cassio. Investigators found bank messages and transfers that linked his accounts with the same shadowy LLCs that had received funds from Cassandra. More damning was a voice clip Mara had secured by posing as a concerned colleague. Dr. Cassio, in a recorded phone call, had discussed keeping the regimen for the girls and had made a notation about frequency that, to a trained ear, and the later toxicology, suggested a plan of repeated administration. He claimed professional necessity. Investigators saw collusion. Prosecutors would later charge him with fraud and with complicity in an attempted homicide, phrases that were, in court filings, careful and precise. Arrest came quietly in the pre-dawn hours at Dr. Cassio's condo. Officers, having built a case over the previous days, took him with hands respectful and firm. He was escorted in handcuffs that glinted and then vanished behind legal haggling. The charges, at first, were procedural: fraud, based on the improper writing of prescriptions and the manipulation of patient charts, conspiracy for financial dealings with Cassandra, and an attempted homicide clause for the alleged involvement in administering compounds. He pleaded not guilty, and later would vehemently deny any intent to harm the children. "I treated them," he said at his arraignment, voice steady, "and I sought to help a family in crisis." The public, when it finally learned of the case, reacted with an ugly hunger for the tidy narrative: the villain caught, the traumatized children recovering, the billionaire avenger who saved his family. But truth in such matters resists simplification. Cassandra's disappearance refused closure. Dr. Cassio's arrest fed a sense of order, but the question of Cassandra's fate remained open, a wound without a scab.
Media outlets published the grainy footage of the figure at the gate and ran graphic reenactments that irked Edward to his core. He issued a statement through counsel asking for privacy and for the recognition that the twins were recovering and would require quiet. He refused to participate in televised debates that dined on the particulars of the case. As the immediate legal machinery spun, the girls were moved to a new city under protective orders.
Edward, who had spent his career dividing his time between boardrooms and aircraft hangars, canceled flights and meetings and learned to be present in the small, mundane way that speaks of permanence. He made PB&J sandwiches in the afternoons. He sat through the recital of a school song and learned to cheer when his daughters performed off-key. He learned the layout of his mother's spare closet and how to thread a tiny dress back onto a hanger without ripping the seam. The physical recovery was visible. Within weeks, the color returned to their cheeks and their eyes regained some of their old mischief. Psychologists assessed them and recommended long-term therapy for trauma and nutritional support. The therapists spoke to Edward about the slow work of rebuilding trust. He sat in those sessions with a tremor of humility, the man who had thought his wealth could buy everything, now learning that presence was the only currency that mattered. The legal world continued its slow, granular work. Prosecutors filed formal charges against Dr. Cassio. He was arraigned and held on bail that was laughable to the public, but meaningful in legal terms. Cassandra, still missing, was the subject of both an open investigation and a civil inquisition from the family. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her assets, minimal compared to Edward's, were porous through layers of proxies. The maternal grandparents, who had once publicly urged the system to act, now hired counsel and tried to shield their own complicity. Attorneys drew the family into layers of testimony and counter-testimony that made even the journalists' pens dull. The hardest, quietest part came months later, when the girls, now in a slower arc of health, started to ask questions with the bluntness of children whose moral imaginations are still forming. "Why won't she come home?" Bia asked one evening, toy cars arranged like a small city on the carpet. "Did she get lost?" Ana, in a voice that made Edward's throat close, asked if Cassie, her name for Cassandra from the days when concerns had not yet hardened into accusation, would ever come to birthday parties again. Edward answered as honestly as he could without traumatizing them further. He spoke of investigations and police and the way that sometimes people make really terrible choices. He told them he loved them and that he would always protect them. He did not say mother when he could say Cassandra, because names carry the power of stories, and stories were unfinished. He took them to a pediatrician not connected to the earlier case and allowed them to ask simple, non-judgmental questions. He sat through therapy sessions and learned to be still with them in the quiet, to sit at the foot of the bed and not leave until sleep took them. Months passed, and the legal machine moved at the unrelenting pace unique to it. Dr. Cassio's trial date was set. Evidence was catalogued with clinical exactness.
Prosecutors prepared to present the chat logs, the bank transfers, the voice files, and the lab confirmations. Mara, whose tenacity had been a constant through the case, was subpoenaed to testify about her methods and the way she had collected the incriminating audio and visual logs without compromising the legal chain of custody. The defense prepared to attack the reliability of witnesses, to question the lab's protocols, to present alternate narratives. Perhaps the girls had psychosomatic issues. Perhaps there had been a mix-up. Perhaps the private sample had been contaminated. The argument would be constructed in court as one of reasonable doubt. Outside the courtrooms, the question of Cassandra's fate refused easy answer. Months after the fire, a new piece of footage surfaced, this one captured by a traffic camera miles from the estate, that showed a woman matching her height and wearing a dark coat walking toward a dock where a small boat tied up. The frame was small and gray. The face was not visible. Experts could not conclusively verify it.
Some argued the graininess made it useless. Others claimed it suggested she had fled the city. The police kept the file open as an active investigation. Her name remained on the missing persons list. In civil filings, prosecutors would later mark her as presumed at large in their timeline to explain the context of her actions. The girls, in the end, healed in the way children sometimes do, rapidly and with a capacity for resilience that stunned the clinicians. They showed little sign in public of what had been. They returned to school with the measured support of a private arrangement that offered counselors and small classrooms. Edward rebuilt a portion of the house in a more modest way, eschewing a return to ostentation in favor of simple rooms where the girls could leave crayons and books where they liked. He took a leave from his companies, handing the day-to-day to trusted deputies as he focused on being present. Dr. Cassio's trial proceeded with its percussion of witnesses and exhibits. Prosecutors introduced the lab confirmations, the printed chat logs, and the bank transfers that tied his accounts to the same chain of transfers that drained Cassandra's accounts to gambling platforms. They played the grainy audio that Mara had secured, and they called staff to testify about the after-hours visits and unusual prescriptions. The defense attacked with experts who suggested alternate explanations, laboratory cross-contamination, misinterpretation of medical shorthand, the vulnerability of anecdotal testimony. It was a legal contest that forced the family to relive the slow bleed of those months. In the end, the jury found Dr. Cassio guilty on several counts of insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. The attempted homicide charges were downgraded in plea negotiations to an aggravated assault count before sentencing.
He was given a term that reflected both the legal realities of proving intent and the moral desire to see consequences. He would spend years in the correctional system, his license revoked, his career shattered. To the public, he became a textbook villain. To some of his former colleagues, a cautionary tale about the corruptions that can take root when power and access meet moral failure. Cassandra, however, remained the unwound center of story. Years later, when the case had settled into headlines and then into the quieter files of legal clerks in memory, a private investigator hired by Cassandra's parents found a small, weathered photograph in an abandoned storage unit miles from the coast. A woman, back turned, standing on the deck of a ferry with a wind-blown coat and a backpack. The photo was undated. The handwriting on the back, someone's, perhaps hers, read, "The sea remembers." It was a line that could be interpreted in any number of ways, as escape, as a plea, as a fantasy. It did not answer the question. Edward learned, slowly, to live alongside the absence of closure. He visited the burned house once, a year after the fire, and stood with his hands in his pockets as an investigator measured the charred beams and spoke of the little decisions that grew into catastrophe. He thought about time and attention and the strange arrogance of wealth, that it can move mountains but not, in the end, learn to be human in the daily ways that mattered. He thought of Cassandra in a complicated collage of anger and pity. He could not bring himself to hate her wholly, nor could he forgive the choices she had made. At night, when the girls slept, he would sometimes linger at their door and think of the days before the quiet began, of laughter at breakfast, of tiny mismatched socks, of the absurdity of his earlier confidence that compensation and care could substitute for time. He learned to answer their small questions with anchored truths, that adults sometimes fail, that love can be steady, and that safety is something he would now build with his presence as its foundation, rather than with walls of glass and security gates. The public conversation about the case became, over time, less about scandal and more about vigilance. Parenting columnists wrote op-eds about emotional presence. Social workers used the story in training seminars about signs of abuse hidden behind privilege. People argued about the ethics of a private investigation carried out before reporting to police. Journalists wrote long-form pieces about addiction, the intersection of gambling and desperation, and the ways that wealth can hide suffering as easily as it can alleviate it. The last definitive document the family received was an official note from the police 2 years after the fire, declaring Cassandra still an active subject of the investigation, but listing her status as unlocated. The phrase sat in a file drawer like a small gray stone.
It allowed neither closure nor hope. It merely acknowledged that the matter remained unsettled. One evening, long after the trials and plea deals and the fires of public attention had cooled, Edward sat in the garden with a printed photograph he kept folded in his pocket, the one from the day he adopted the girls, 2 infants curled against his chest. Bia, now older and stubborn in the way only children can be, had painted him a crooked sun and taped it to the kitchen wall. Ana, who had started to rebuild trust more slowly, slept with a stuffed animal she called Bear. In that garden, with the faint hum of the city beyond the hedges, Edward allowed himself to grieve for what had been and to consult the steadier, harder work of being a father. He sometimes found himself thinking of Cassandra, not with the old, unexamined fury that had burned in the months after the discovery, but with a recognition of the human cost of addiction and desperation. He knew, in a practical and moral sense, that some crimes must be punished. He also knew that punishment alone does not stitch together what is broken. He apprenticed himself to presence. He stopped scheduling flights that landed him home at odd hours and instead booked whole blocks of time for school plays, doctor's appointments, and bedtime stories. At the end of each day, he would check the police files, as if hoping some new, conclusive piece of footage would appear, another camera angle that would show a face no longer ambiguous. None did. The last image the public carried was the grainy security frame, the shadow at the gate, the woman who could be Cassandra or could be any number of figures who haunt the edges of the story. That graininess became a metaphor for the case itself, blurred, open to interpretation, resistant to tidy conclusion. If you have an opinion about what happened to Cassandra, if you believe she escaped or perished in the smoke or did something else entirely, comment below. The case that began inside one house and echoed into a community remains, for some details, unresolved. The girls grew up. They learned that the safest thing a parent can do is to show up and to stay. And in that, the scar of their story becomes a lesson that clings. Wealth shields you from many things, but it cannot purchase the hours you miss. It cannot, by itself, be a substitute for the quiet work of love. The rest, the courts, the convictions, the unanswered questions, become part of the background of a life rebuilt, imperfectly and insistently, around a table where 2 little bowls now hold full and hearty portions, and where a father, finally present, watches his daughters eat.